This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien begins today's show. He talks about his recent travels to North Dakota and how their market concerns compare to Kansas. Continuing the show is Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, K-State soil fertility specialist, with information about the updated soil test interpretations and fertilizer recommendations in Kansas publication. Chip Redmond completes the show with a weather update. This K-State meteorologist says people can be expecting warmer temperatures and possibly a weather pattern repeat. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update, and we're joined by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, Shelby. How are you?
Doing good, Dan. Kicking off our grain market conversation with what are futures looking like?
Still maintaining a low pattern, reflecting in this time period the general idea that if there are threats to the market that would come out of South America in particular, particularly in Brazil, for both the second crop corn and for the soybean crop, that they're down the road. There's some moisture that's come up front now during this time frame. So really, it's a horse race, I guess, between the damage that was caused earlier and the question of whether late moisture can overcome the early damage. So I think the way our markets are functioning, they're really have not been paying much attention to CONAB and some other forecasts from in-country. They must be waiting for verification coming from the USDA in the next February World Ag Board WASDE report. So we shall see where all that goes. And I think that we're down towards, for corn, we're down at historic lows here. If you look at where we closed on yesterday, $451 for prices. Some cash bids in the area. Cash bids are all hanging around, again, $450, $475. So we have some pretty decent basis levels. It's almost as if the cash market is loath to go where the futures have already gone and are showing that a little more reticence, I guess, to going lower just by the strength of their basis bids. And should add that for soybeans, here we're at $12.23, closed down some 17 plus cents yesterday. Cash bids just really vary across the state, and that's been this ongoing pattern that you and I have been watching. That at the export-oriented places, say Topeka, in particular, a 35-cent under basis. For soybeans, you go out to Colby and Garden City, you're 95 cents to $1.10 and these would be the best bids for the elevators in those localized regions. And others are kind of in the way. You have a kind of in the middle, the Hutchinson bid at 10 under. You have a Salina bid, surprisingly 50 under. I say surprisingly because a lot of times the Salina bid will be sort of in line at that export market with where Topeka and Hutchinson are. It's again export oriented, and Columbus Southeast also doing decent. The wheat market has closed yesterday actually up 11 cents, 637, and the cash bids, a lot of variation around the state. Again, on the low side, you've got 562, 582, 586 in Colby, Garden City, Columbus, but then you're above $6. It's 612 in Topeka, 616 Hutchinson, 617 in Salina. All the new crop bids are, in the eastern two-thirds of the state, kind of hovering between 580 and 603, 577 in Southeast, 573 in the Colby region, 583 in Garden City. So I guess I'd say that there's no sugarcoating that these aren't the prices we'd seen this summer. A continuation of generally lower trends at this time. The market has a general narrative that it's following until it gets other information of holding steady in low area at these low areas, and And that's kind of where we stand. I would say when you look at the seasonal patterns, late January into February can often be for some of these key grain markets a pretty docile time in the market. And I think personally, I'm thinking that there's a growing possibility that adjustments will come in the to the lower side in the February WASDE report, and that's I guess that's the question of the hour right now for anybody holding these crops unsold. Will we get confirmation on what we seem to see as significant crop damage down there, and will that give people a return to storage? So far, they've been holding steadily, but if that strength doesn't come and we move into February and March, then it has pretty significant negative financial repercussions for Kansas farmers.
And thinking maybe a little bit past Kansas, Dan, you recently went on a trip to North Dakota. And so kind of what were some concerns up there that might also be something that Kansas producers want to think about?
They're concerned about the wheat markets just as we are. Although the hard red wheat export market has shown more weakness than the hard red spring market. It's really interesting to see where the futures spec trader positions are, and again, most cash market folks aren't paying that much attention to that. But when you look at but I think if we're trying to get an understanding of what the market is thinking, you look at whether those that make money based on just movement, again, the managed money or the speculative folks, are they selling? Do they have large selling positions or they have large buying positions? If anything, proportionally, the hard red spring short position is, well, it's either impressive or depressive, depending on how you're looking at that. Even more negative than the hard red winter position, and that was of concern to them. Thought-provoking for in North Dakota. Most farmers, if they have wheat, they're storing it on farm in their own bins. We have the pattern in Kansas to where we'll move our wheat, and the elevators will typically store that. In fact, shortfall in wheat quantity is a real negative, harmful situation that's developed for Kansas elevators. Again, we need the quantity of bushels for storage and potential storage profits. So that was an issue up there. They're all that much closer to bioenergy related issues. They have a lot of entrepreneurial growth in soybean processing and going into renewable diesel. They up there are looking at canola production coming out of Canada. I know we have the potential Western Kansas to crush and grow canola as well. So that's something that's coming for us. But they're looking at that and seeing the potential growth in that sector as one of their bright spots. For corn, they do wonder about the prospects in the corn market. I guess just like we do. And if you asked a group of Kansas farmers, and I know that this week we have a commodity groups meeting, I think in Salina, they'll be wondering about corn versus soybean acres. That we did have a report came out. Now this was an independent, I think it's from Farm Futures. I think we can name that. It's non-proprietary, but it was a survey of like 858 farmers. So not as big by any stretch as a USDA survey, but came out and basically talked about a 1 or 2 million acres less change this year in corn acres, or several million acre more increase in soybean acres. Hard red spring acres, whereas they plant in the U.S., it was other spring wheats, how they tied that as hard red spring and some spring white wheat. Last year, 11.3 million acres. That survey came in and said 9. So that when that information came out to this group of crop insurance folks, who make their living off of selling insurance for acreage, that brought a quote pall to the crowd. So so they sit in a situation just like we do, and they're worried about where their acreage will go and how their markets will respond. They do sit closer to the Pacific Northwest, and rail sales to Asia are more of a possibility at lower cost to get to Vancouver and in Canada, or Portland if it's in the U.S. They wonder about the quantity of sales overseas. So I guess I wouldn't say they're appalled by the low rates of hard red spring wheat sales heading that direction, but they were, I guess, incredulous, just as we are, of the extremely low path for hard red winter wheat export sales, which is that's a big issue in these markets. So you asked me what's going on up there. Just the same as here, people wondering about where their markets are going and what the prospects are for the coming year, and hoping that cash prices will be at levels that allow for profitability on farm enterprises, and for the crop insurance industry will lead them to good sales. So,
conversation back to Kansas. What are we seeing for ethanol?
We're seeing ethanol profitability 2 weeks ago had dropped, at least by my own calculations, had dropped into the negative area. We had been making, I think, for the month of December, about 7 cents a gallon, and that's down from 30 and 60 in previous months. It dropped the first couple weeks in January down to a 7-cent loss, and it was thought-provoking to me anyway to see that reports of the latest weekly ethanol production number having dropped significantly down to, I think, 850 some million gallons, and that being below 950, is considerably more. So the ethanol industry generally showing some sign of slowdown. The cash prices in Kansas ethanol plants as of January the 25th, yesterday, ranged for corn from $4.70 and a quarter to $4.97 and a quarter, average $4.83, and that really continues to stand out as the high average bid in the U.S. Illinois bids about $4.50, as is Indiana, about $4.60, $4.56 in Iowa. So the Kansas bid's higher than Iowa. Nebraska, just to the north of us, $4.60. So I'm not sure exactly why that is, that we're doing better, other than, we do have a logistical advantage in the ethanol that we grow in terms of moving it to the West Coast markets. And we have a lot of competition for corn with feedlots and such. So both those factors probably help to boost our ethanol cash price. So you see that, say, a price of $4.83 for corn in Kansas, and look at and compare that to the elevator bids. The highest elevator bid, $4.72 in Garden City, as you were talking about earlier. So at this point, still a demand center for ethanol, some profitability there, and we'll see where that goes.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our grain market update.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing a recent publication from K-State. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Dorivar, this updated publication titled Soil Test Interpretations and Fertilizer Recommendations in Kansas. And what does that publication mean?
Yes, Shelby, this is a fairly popular publication. Obviously, as you mentioned in the title, it's a publication basically that providing guidance for fertilizer recommendations for main crops and forages in Kansas. The soil test interpretation and fertilizer recommendation. The publication number that is often referenced also is the MS 2586. And again, really relevant to, provide guidance for fertilizer recommendations in the state.
Dorivar, talking through some of those different recommendations, and the first one involving nitrogen.
Yes, we've done several changes and updates to these publications. It's been a few years since we have the last update, and of course we have a lot more new research. Many things have changed in terms of management and crop production, genetics, and this is a type of recommendation that really needs to be reviewed and updated pretty regularly, because again, production systems in agriculture is quite dynamic with new technology, and again, we need to keep up with that. We have some research to support some of these changes in recent years, and we're really excited to make some of these changes. Like you mentioned, one of the component that has the biggest change has been the nitrogen recommendation. And one of the things that is perhaps a little bit more particular about Kansas is the different cropping systems that we have, environments and soils, which obviously require a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we provide recommendations, especially as we're trying to be providing more site-specific recommendations for different environments. And to reflect a little bit of that in the case of nitrogen, we're still providing the mechanistic yield-based recommendation, which has been the historic approach for us here in Kansas. But we are able now to break down different components of the equation of that fertilizer recommendation to allow basically the user to make adjustments based on the specific management that they are doing. In the past, we used to have essentially one coefficient times the yield, expected yield for that particular field, and other adjustments in terms of previous crops, organic matter, tillage, and so on. That single coefficient now basically broke down in multiple components. One of them is looking at the crop internal efficiency, which is basically what is the efficiency of the system. For example, if we're looking at irrigated versus dry land, they are just completely different in terms of how they respond to nitrogen and how efficient they are in terms of using that nitrogen fertilizer. So that's one component. The other component is the fertilizer recovery efficiency. And this is pretty important, for farmers who are really improving how they apply that nitrogen fertilizer. Somebody who is doing an excellent job, perhaps injecting nitrogen, using inhibitors and so on, obviously have a different efficiency compared to somebody that perhaps is broadcasting or applying nitrogen in the wrong time of the year. And so again, that's another component that is included now in this new revised recommendation. Another component also that provide a little bit more flexibility is the ability to provide adjustments to the profile nitrogen tests that we collect. This is a very important component for us in Kansas. In parts of the state, we can have significant amount of profile nitrogen, residual nitrogen. However, we also have the risk of losing some of that nitrogen before the crop can take up. And here is where we basically, in this revised recommendation, we are able to provide some flexibility for the user, basically to make adjustments, in cases where we have those higher risks of losing that nitrogen from the previous years. So overall, basically, we went to perhaps a little bit more simplistic, using a single coefficient, to something a little bit more complex, where we're trying to provide, like I say, a lot more flexibility for the user. And again, reflecting the different conditions we have in Kansas, which is the reality for us. It's really not a one size fits all. We really need to keep in mind that we have different soils, environments, and production system, and this provide us, I believe, the framework to be able to keep improving in the future. One thing I want to highlight with this revised publication is that our goal now is really to start making updates more regularly, and that's one big change as well in this publication, the overall format and the way it's laid out. So in other words, will allow us to basically go and make changes to specific components. And this is something we hope to do more regularly as more information becomes available, things that we can, again, improve. Like I say, in the case of nitrogen, we are looking at different coefficients now, and that opened the opportunity to go and target specific components and keep improving, being even more specific for conditions in the future.
Something else that saw an update in this publication is some newer recommendations for lime.
Yes, this is, again, we have other components that have been updated. In the case of lime recommendation guidelines, we make changes to reflect the new methods that we are using for buffer pH nowadays. Obviously, we move away from the traditional SMP method that we used in the past for buffer pH to the Sikora buffer. And so we do have new equations to reflect that. And so that's another change as well. And throughout the document, I would say we are updating to reflect a little bit more of the newer soil test methods that we are using today compared to previous years.
A lot of information in this publication, and something else that producers can find is recommendations for phosphorus and potassium.
Yes, overall, this is the main document that we use for all recommendations. In the case of phosphorus and potassium, we also made some changes. Overall, I would say the equations has basically keeping the same at this point for phosphorus and potassium. However, we make some clarification and adjustments in terms of the categories we're using for crop response, basically the crop response categories. So those are included now for both phosphorus and potassium. We also clarify and make changes in terms of the soil test methods that we are using today that are more popular, especially the ones that are more relevant for us in Kansas. And so that's also one aspect that is updated in the case of phosphorus and potassium recommendation. However, like I said, the overall equations basically remain the same. However, this is going to be the next component that will be updated fairly soon.
And how are you hoping that this publication supports producers in their decisions?
Yes, this is a quite comprehensive publication. There are many crops included here, obviously covering the main field crops for Kansas. We also have other crops, forages that are also included here that may be not as popular, but also quite relevant as well. And so again, it's really including all the key production crops and forages in the state. So that's one key component. One of the key aspects also I want to emphasize with this publication is that, from my standpoint, the agronomic component is really important. We tend to focus a little bit more on the agronomic component here. But of course, we all know that this is very relevant, ultimately from the economic standpoint, how we are efficient in terms of using this costly input, which is fertilizer. And so that's perhaps one of the main impacts. And of course, there are also some components from the environmental standpoint. Avoiding excessive applications, which is costly, can also cause some issues from the environmental standpoint. So all of those aspects are key and can affect our production system quite significantly. And so again, from that standpoint, I think this is we are really happy with this progress that we make in terms of making changes. But most importantly, one of the things that I'm really excited about is the improvement in terms of clarity, in terms of flow of this publication, especially the ability to be able to make changes in future fairly easily that, again, hopefully will be much often.
If producers would like to find this publication, where's the best place to find it?
Yes, this publication should be available in our K-State Research and Extension bookstore. Basically, search for the soil test interpretation and fertilizer recommendations in Kansas, which is the title, and MF 2586. One thing I would like to also emphasize here is that this making updates to a large publication like this is significant work, a lot of research going behind this. So it's really a group effort. In the Department of Agronomy, we do have the soil fertility working group, where we have multiple faculty doing work in soil fertility that are involved with these publications. And so I'm speaking today, but it's really a large group of faculty in the Department of Agronomy contributing to this, not just the publication itself, but also significant amount of research that has been done in recent years.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about soil test interpretations and fertilizer recommendations in Kansas.
Thank you.
That was K-State soil fertility specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, and he was talking about the publication MF 2586, Soil Test Interpretations and Fertilizer Recommendations in Kansas. You will be able to find this publication in the K-State Research and Extension bookstore. However, the bookstore is currently experiencing some issues, so when the bookstore is back up and running, I will let you guys know so you can go find this publication. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have a weather update with Chip Redmond up next. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update. And as always, we're joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Chip, what weather have we been seeing this past week?
A little bit of everything, really. We haven't had thunderstorms recently, but we had freezing rain, we've had fog, rain, and no wind. We haven't had any wind. It's been very calm wind-wise, and we'll take that, especially in January. But we've had a lot of moisture in place across the state, a lot of fog, a lot of overcast skies, and very light southerly flow that's moved this moisture up from the Gulf, and really it sits across most of the central United States. In fact, on Wednesday, I think it was, there were 1,300 counties in the United States that had dense fog advisories. So very dreary and overcast, but we've been slowly warming up those temperatures gradually, and as a result, we've been eating into the snowpack, probably the longest I've seen snowpack take to melt around here. But we eliminated a lot of the snowpack across the state, and that the temperature contrast and that warmer, moist air above that snowpack also really helped that fog situation. Or helped develop the fog, that is. So we had some freezing rain at the start of the week and freezing fog. It was a very interesting situation where it wasn't sticking to the trees because the temperature was actually above freezing, but that snow on the ground, and it kept the ground below freezing. And so when precipitation fell, it would freeze on the surfaces and on the roads, and it was just a mess. And we had a lot of school closings as a result, especially when you get that water on top of that packed ice. That's not a good situation. But thankfully, most of the ice is melted, and we've continued to gradually warm through the week.
And as we're thinking about this different precipitation, do we have drought monitor improvements?
Yeah, we haven't had a whole lot of precipitation this week, but there's been some adjustments to the drought monitor that line up better with certain indices. And as a result, we removed a lot of severe drought across the state. In fact, we took it down from about 15% of the state down to 5% of the state, which is a pretty good change. So a lot of drought improvements. Most of those happened in the western and central part of the state, where they had some heavier rains in December that didn't quite get accounted for, and some of that snow also melted.
And Chip, could we possibly be expecting to see a pattern replay of what we had in December?
Yes, so right now with this southerly flow and moist air mass, very similar to what we had around Christmas time, where we had a really prominent jet across the Pacific, classic El Nino pattern. We're still in a strong El Nino. And so this pattern is very, very similar. We got that jet across Pacific. It's a little bit further south, but keeping the western United States super active and keeping us in this stagnant pattern. And that's going to continue. We're going to get some drier air finally moving in as we break between storms starting Sunday and into early next week. We're going to keep those temperatures on the warm side as a result. And we'll be very warm in the 50s potentially. And that will allow us to have a brief reprieve before that jet stream likely starts to retract, and we see a big storm system swoop in here probably around the 5th to 7th of February. And it looks like it could be some snow component. That'll be our next real big weather maker. That's also going to bring a pattern change and break the pattern down across the United States. And very similar to what we saw late December into early January, where we had a really active storm pattern. And likely we'll see some cooler weather as you get into mid-February. More seasonal and potentially colder than normal.
So as we are looking at next week, you said it's warming up, but just still staying dry with it?
For the most part, dry, yeah. I think we'll see some sun, more than we've seen this week, that's for sure. And we'll have some pretty big temperature swings from the evening to the daytime, but overall dry conditions with maybe the next chance of moisture potentially late next week, but doesn't look like a big precipitation maker.
And Chip, if people would like to stay up to date with the weather around Kansas, how can they do that?
Yeah, so they can check us out. Check the Mesonet out for real-time data and historical data, some pretty cool data sets to look at from this 16-day-ish cold snap that we saw across the state. And you can find that at mesonet.ksu.edu. That's mesonet.ksu.edu.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. I will link the Mesonet in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.